The wind in Wyoming territory had 1,000 voices in winter, and in the year of our Lord 1885, most of them were mean. It was a wind that scraped the prairie clean, piling snow in drifts that buried fences and turned the familiar landscape into a strange, white desert. Night came early to the town of Silt Creek, not easing in but falling like a heavy blanket, smothering the last of the day's gray light. The town itself was little more than a string of wooden buildings huddled along the wagon road, a necessary stop for the timber, hides and ore that had to get to the railroad 60 miles east. In Silt Creek, life was measured by the seasons, and the memory of last summer's drought was a raw spot in the town's mind. Water was not just water, it was life, and the lack of it was a quiet terror that lingered in every conversation. Ada Hart knew the sound of that wind better than any other. It was the soundtrack to her solitude, from the front window of her small pine-shingled house, which was also her shop. She watched the snow blow sideways down the empty street. A simple sign, neatly painted, read A. Hart Seamstress and Mending. It did not mention her other trade, the one learned from books and hard necessity. It did not say she could set a bone, stitch a wound, or brew a tea that could break a fever. The people of Silt Creek knew, and that was enough. They came to her front door, into the clean, warm room that smelled of soap and ironing and herbal tinctures. They brought their torn shirts and their split hands, and she tended to both with the same quiet competence. She was a woman in her early 30s, with a stillness about her that some mistook for coldness. She helped anyone who asked, often taking payment in firewood or flour from those who had nothing else. But she let no one pass the curtain that separated her shop from her small living quarters, and no one, ever, was invited into the small back parlor. That room was a fortress. It held a sturdy rocking chair, a cold hearth, and a small wooden chest. Inside the chest, tied with a faded ribbon, was a bundle of letters. They were the ghosts of a life she had almost lived, a promise broken by a man who had listened to whispers. The whispers said Ada Hart was too independent, too bookish, too quiet, unfit to be a wife. The words had built a wall around her heart, and the door to the back parlor was the final stone set in place. She had her work, her small measure of respect in the town, and that was all she allowed herself to need. That same afternoon, Eli Boone stood in the lee of the livery stable, the wind pulling at his worn coat. He was a man in his late 30s, his face weathered by sun and worry, with the steady eyes of someone who had seen too much of the world to be easily surprised. He had come to town for salt and ammunition and to have the blacksmith look at a bent plowshare. His business was done, but he lingered, his gaze fixed on the frozen ribbon of Silt Creek itself. A crust of ice, thick and white, covered the sluggish water. He measured it with his eyes, calculating. His small ranch, 5 miles upstream, depended on an irrigation ditch that fed from this creek. That ditch, his lifeline, ran through a section of land that Silas Vane now claimed belonged under his control. Eli had the deed, signed and sealed, but Vane had ambition. And in Wyoming, ambition could be a more powerful thing than a piece of paper. He turned from the creek, his jaw tight, and headed toward his horse. He preferred the company of his cattle to that of most men. Cattle were honest in their needs. Silas Vane was not an honest man, but he was a smooth one. He stood before the town council, which consisted of 3 nervous men in a cold room above the general store, and spoke of progress. He was a man in his 40s, soft in the middle but with eyes as hard and cold as river stones. He talked about a new, wider ditch, a project for the common good, one that would guarantee water for the whole town, even in a drought. He spoke as if he were bestowing a great gift, ignoring the fact that his project would require him to seize control of the main water rights, including the flow to Eli Boone's property. At his side, Deputy Crane nodded along, a friendly, vacant smile on his face. Crane was Vane's man, a shadow that did his bidding while pretending to serve the law. The council members shifted in their chairs. They remembered the cracked earth and thirsty cattle of the summer before. Vane's words were a temptation, a promise of security. He spoke of bringing order to the territory. There were rumors. He reminded them of rustlers growing bold along the creek, preying on honest folk. He happened to have papers. He said, legal documents that would allow him to secure the area and ensure the water flowed where it was most needed. He did not say that where it was most needed was, in his opinion, his own vast and growing herds. The law, as Silas Vane saw it, was a tool that belonged to the man rich enough to wield it. Later, as the light began to fail, a shout went up from the edge of town. The winter mail coach, fighting its way through the storm, had slid off the road into a shallow, ice-choked ravine by the time Ada arrived, pulling a thick shawl over her head. A small group of men were standing around, staring uselessly at the wreckage. The driver, a young man pale with cold and shock, was trying to calm the one remaining horse. The other lay still in the ditch, its legs tangled in the harness, its neck bent at an unnatural angle. The men talked of getting ropes, of waiting for the storm to let up. Ada did not wait. She slid down the snowy bank, her boots sinking into the icy mud. The living horse was frantic, and the driver could not cut it free while the dead one acted as an anchor. Ada looked at the situation, her mind clear and practical. She spoke to the driver, her voice calm and firm. "Hold him steady," she said. She took the heavy knife he offered and, without a moment's hesitation, began to cut the thick leather traces connecting the dead animal to the coach and its panicked partner. The men on the road watched in silence as this quiet seamstress worked with a grim determination. When the harness was cut, the dead weight remained. It would take 4 men to haul the carcass out of the way. They did not have 4 men to spare. Ada looked around, her eyes landing on a stout, fallen tree limb. With the driver's help, she wedged it under the dead horse. "Now," she called up to the onlookers. "I need your weight." 2 of the men, shamed into action, carefully made their way down the bank. Together, they put their shoulders to the lever. The frozen ground groaned, ice cracked, and slowly, agonizingly, the heavy body of the horse was rolled aside, clearing the path. The driver was then able to lead the surviving animal up to the road. He looked at Ada, his face a mixture of gratitude and awe. "I don't know how to thank you, ma'am," he stammered. "You can thank me by getting inside where it is warm before you freeze to death," Ada replied, already climbing back up the bank, her skirt heavy with mud and ice. She wanted nothing more than the quiet of her own home, the familiar work of her hands. She wanted to mend what was torn and heal what was hurt and be left alone. She did not want to be part of the town's larger struggles. But as she walked back toward the flickering lights of Silt Creek, the wind carried the lowing of hungry cattle from the stockyards, a sound of desperation. It carried the scent of wood smoke, the fuel of survival, and it seemed to carry the weight of the whole town's fear, the fear of a dry summer, the fear of powerful men, the fear of a future as uncertain as the road in a blizzard. Eli Boone, riding out of town, saw her alone, determined figure walking into the storm, and he touched the brim of his hat in a silent gesture of respect. He had his own battles to fight, a line to hold against the greed that was coming for his water, for his land, in Silt Creek. No one's peace was truly their own. It was a fragile thing, easily broken, and the first cracks were already beginning to show. The storm did not relent. It deepened, swallowing Silt Creek in a churning vortex of wind and snow. The world shrank to the halos of light cast by lanterns in fogged windows. At the stagecoach station, the air was thick with the smell of wet wool and fear. The half-dozen stranded passengers huddled together, their talk small and defeated against the roar of the blizzard. The wind howled through the gaps in the plank walls, and the bell in the chapel steeple, caught by a gust, would toll a single, hollow note, a sound like a warning. Ada moved through the small, crowded room with a quiet purpose that stood out against the general helplessness. She had brought a stack of her thickest wool blankets from her shop and a large pot of coffee, which she poured into tin cups for shaking hands. She spoke little, offering a blanket here, a warm cup there, her presence a small, steady anchor in the chaos of the night. It was while she was tucking a blanket around the shoulders of an elderly woman that she saw a flicker of movement beneath a long wooden bench pushed against the far wall. It was nothing more than a shadow shifting within a shadow, but it was enough. Setting the coffee pot down, Ada picked up a lantern and made her way over, the floorboards creaking under her boots. She held the light low, huddled in the dusty space beneath the bench, trying to make herself as small as a forgotten piece of luggage. Was a child, a girl, perhaps 8 years old, with wide, frightened eyes that caught the lantern light. She was wrapped in a threadbare coat, clutching a rough burlap sack to her chest as if it held all the world's treasures. One of her knees was scraped raw, a dark patch against the pale, chapped skin. She trembled, not just from the cold, but from a fear so profound it seemed to have settled in her very bones. Ada knelt, careful not to make any sudden moves. She kept her voice low, softer than the wind. "It is all right," she said. "You must be frozen through. There is coffee and warm blankets by the stove." The girl only stared, her small body rigid. Ada did not press. She simply held out a hand, palm up, a gesture not of taking but of offering. After a long moment, a small, cold hand crept out and touched hers. Ada gently led the child from under the bench and into the weak circle of warmth around the pot-belly stove. She wrapped the smallest, softest blanket around the girl's shoulders and sat with her on a crate, away from the others, letting the silence and the warmth do their work. After a few minutes, Ada spoke again. "I am Ada. I live just across the way. My house is warmer than this place. Would you like to come?" The girl gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Ada led her out into the screaming wind, shielding the child with her own body as they crossed the short distance to her shop. Inside, the warmth was immediate, a comforting press against their frozen faces. Ada bolted the door, shutting out the storm. She led the girl past the curtain into her living space and sat her in a chair by the hearth, where the embers still glowed. She prepared a mug of hot cocoa, rich with milk and a spoonful of precious sugar. She knelt and offered it to the child, whose hands were still shaking too much to hold it steady. Ada held the mug for her as she took small, careful sips. The warmth seemed to travel through the girl, loosening the tight knot of fear inside her. She looked around the small, tidy room, her eyes taking in the neat stack of books, the basket of mending, the quiet order of Ada's life. Her gaze lingered on Ada herself, a long, searching look that was far older than her years. When the mug was empty, the girl finally spoke, her voice a tiny whisper, so quiet Ada had to lean in to hear it over the wind rattling the window pane. "You need a husband, and I just want a mom." The words, so simple and so sharp, struck Ada with the force of a physical blow. They were the plain, unvarnished truth, a child's assessment of the two great emptinesses in the room. In that moment, the girl saw not the capable seamstress or the town's impromptu nurse, but the lonely woman who lived behind a curtained-off life. And in her own want, she laid bare a vulnerability so deep it ached. The confession cracked something open between them. The girl, whose name Ada learned was Rosie, began to talk. The words came in a halting rush, a story of running away from a remote cattle camp run by a foreman whose hands were quick and hard. She spoke of thin blankets and watery soup and days so long they blurred together. Then she mentioned something that made Ada's blood run cold. She had seen Deputy Crane visit the camp more than once, the last time, just 2 days ago. She had been hiding in the tack room and saw the foreman give Crane a thick envelope that he said was from Mr. Vane. The pieces clicked into place. A runaway child was not just a tragedy. In Silk Creek, it was a piece of a larger, more dangerous puzzle. Ada knew she could not send Rosie back to that, and she could not turn her over to the law, not when the law wore Deputy Crane's smiling face. Ada stood and did something she had not done in 7 years. She walked to the door of the back parlor, the room that held her grief locked away. The key turned stiffly in the lock. The air inside was cold and still. She opened the wooden chest, took out a heavy quilt, and made a small, soft bed for Rosie on the floor near the cold hearth. "For tonight," she said softly, "you will be safe here." Rosie curled up under the quilt, her small burlap sack tucked beside her, and was asleep in minutes. Ada stood watching her, the sight of the sleeping child in that room a strange and painful miracle. A sharp, authoritative knock at the front door shattered the quiet. Ada smoothed her apron, her face settling into a calm, neutral mask, and went to answer it. Deputy Crane stood on her doorstep, shaking snow from his hat. His smile was as wide and false as ever. "Evening, Miss Hart," he said, his eyes scanning the room behind her. "Just checking on everyone. Make sure no strangers are using the storm as cover for trouble. The town council wants a full account of who is in town." "The mail coach driver is in here," Ada said, not moving from the doorway. "He took a bad fall. I am tending to his shoulder." She had, in fact, brought the young man over to give him a proper poultice and a cup of laudanum for the pain. He was now dozing in a chair in the front room. Crane craned his neck. "Is that so? Well, that is mighty good of you." He made as if to leave, then paused. His gaze dropped to the floor, snagging on a small, damp smear of mud just near the curtain leading to her living quarters. It was a partial print, far too small to be hers or the driver's. His eyes flickered up to hers, a question hanging in the air, but he just smiled again. "You have a good night, then," he said, and turned back into the storm. Ada closed the door, her heart pounding. The danger was no longer a vague threat out on the prairie. It was here, on her doorstep. An hour later, another knock came, this one softer, more hesitant. It was Eli Boone. He stood in the swirling snow, an armload of split pine in one arm and a burlap sack in the other. He did not ask to come in. "Figured you could use this to get through the night," he said, his voice a low rumble. The sack was full of salt. Heated in the blacksmith's forge, it would hold its warmth for hours. As Ada took the wood, his eyes drifted past her, into the room, by the stove, where Ada had left them to dry, was a pair of child's boots, worn and scuffed, with a tear near the toe. He saw them. There was no doubt. A dozen questions could have followed. Who do they belong to? Are you in trouble? But Eli asked none of them. He met her eyes for a brief moment, a look of quiet understanding passing between them. He simply nodded, touched the brim of his hat, and disappeared back into the blizzard. His respect for her unspoken boundary was a greater comfort than the firewood. It was a silent promise of trust in a town where trust was becoming as scarce as water in summer. Later, Ada sat in the rocking chair in the back parlor, watching the steady rise and fall of Rosie's breathing. The wind still raged, but inside the small room, a fragile peace had settled. Ada knew what she had to do. When the storm broke, she would not take Rosie to the deputy. She would not send her back to the camp. She would find a way to get her to Sister Alma's mission up in the hills, where she might find real sanctuary. It was a dangerous choice. It meant standing against Silas Vane and his tame lawman. But looking at the small girl sleeping in the room where Ada's own hopes had once died, she knew it was no choice at all. It was the only thing to do. The morning after the blizzard broke clear and cold. The world outside Ada's window transformed into a landscape of breathtaking, silent beauty. The snow draped over every roof and fence post, smoothing the hard edges of the town into soft, white mounds. The sky was a vast, brilliant blue, and the air so clean it stung the lungs. But the peace was an illusion. In a town as small as Silt Creek, a secret was a heavier burden than a winter snowpack, and it seldom stayed buried for long. By the time the sun was fully up, the whispers had already begun. They traveled from the livery to the general store, passed between women sweeping their porches, and mulled over by men clearing paths. The stagecoach driver had talked. He spoke of the seamstress's kindness, her steady hands with a bandage, and he mentioned, just in passing, the pair of tiny, mud-caked boots he had seen by her stove. It was not much, but in the fertile ground of Silt Creek's curiosity, it was enough. A seed of rumor had been planted. Ada knew it the moment she saw Lillian Mayhew making her way across the street, navigating the snowdrifts with the determined air of a woman on a mission. Lillian was the town's primary gatherer and distributor of information, a woman whose inquiries were always wrapped in a thin veneer of neighborly concern. Ada opened the door before Lillian could knock. Her expression was pleasantly neutral. "Good morning." "Lillian, I trust you weathered the storm well." Lillian smiled, a quick, bird-like motion of her head. "As well as can be expected. My dear, a bit of a draft from the window, but we are all blessed to see the sun. I just came over because I seem to have misplaced my finest darning needle. I was wondering if I might borrow one of yours until the smith can make me another." It was a flimsy excuse. Lillian had more needles than a porcupine had quills, but Ada simply nodded and stepped aside to let her into the front room. "While you are here, have a cup of coffee. It is still hot." As Ada went to her sewing box, Lillian's eyes darted around the room, missing nothing. They noted the extra blanket folded on a chair, the small tin cup, scrubbed clean, sitting beside Ada's own on the drying rack. They were hungry eyes, searching for the proof the town was whispering about. Ada returned with the needle. "Here you are. Just be careful with it. The steel is good." "Thank you, dear," Lillian said, her gaze now fixed on the curtain that separated the shop from Ada's living quarters. "It seems so quiet in here. For a moment, I thought I heard another voice." Ada's hands did not stop their work of tidying a stray thread from a spool. "The wind plays tricks after a storm," she said, her voice even. "It gets into the eaves. The coffee is on the stove." The subject was closed. Lillian, getting nothing more, drank her coffee quickly and departed, the needle clutched in her hand like a trophy. Ada watched her go, a knot tightening in her stomach. The town was closing in. Behind the curtain, Rosie was awake. Ada did not scold her for making a sound. Instead, she poured a cup of warm milk and sat with the girl at the small kitchen table. The back parlor, with its ghosts and cold hearth, was left behind. For now, this small, warm kitchen was their world. Ada, who had taught herself everything from anatomy to stitchery, now taught a new subject. She took out a torn shirt from her mending basket. "See this," she said, holding it up. "A tear is just a place where things have come apart. Mending is the art of putting them back together." She showed Rosie how to thread a needle, how to make small, even stitches. Rosie's fingers were clumsy at first, but she was a quick study, her face screwed up in concentration. "Later." Ada took out a reader and pointed to the letters, sounding them out. The quiet moments were a balm, the simple acts of pouring milk, guiding a small hand, the scratch of chalk on a small slate, creating a fragile bubble of peace in the center of the growing storm. An ink smudge on Rosie's finger seemed like a victory, a small mark of ordinary childhood. The fragile peace was shattered in the afternoon. Silas Vane, ever the public benefactor, had organized a soup kitchen in the town hall. He stood on the steps, ladling out thin but hot stew to anyone who came, his voice booming with false charity. He spoke of community, of neighbors helping neighbors in these hard times. Then his tone shifted. "And we must look after the most vulnerable," he declared, his eyes sweeping the small crowd, especially the children. "There are reports of youngsters wandering, leaving the safety of their posts. A child alone is a danger to themselves and a burden on the community. They belong in proper care, in places where they can earn their keep and be given structure and discipline." He did not look at Ada, who stood at the edge of the crowd, but every word was a stone aimed directly at her. She felt the eyes of the townspeople turn toward her, some with pity, some with suspicion. She slipped away before he was finished, her heart cold with dread. The direct threat came an hour later. As she was leaving the general store with a small sack of flour, Deputy Crane fell into step beside her. His smile was as pleasant as the winter sun, and just as cold. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice a low, confidential murmur, "a word of advice. From a friend. I hear you are a charitable woman, but charity has its limits. According to the law, taking in a stray pup is one thing. Taking in a child requires papers, guardianship forms, things you do not have. It would be a terrible shame if a good woman like you were to find herself on the wrong side of a legal matter." He tipped his hat and walked on, leaving his words to hang in the air like frost. The message was clear. Vane would use the law as a weapon, and Crane was the man who would aim it. Ada's first instinct was to flee. The road to Sister Alma's mission was her only hope. She packed a small bag for Rosie with a spare dress, a bar of soap, and the reader. But when she went to the livery to inquire about the state of the roads, the stablemaster gave her the bad news. The melt from the storm had been too fast, the creek had swelled, and the north road was a river of mud. Worse. The wooden bridge that crossed the ravine 5 miles out was gone, its timbers smashed and swept away by the flood. There was no way to get to the mission. They were trapped. She returned to her shop, the weight of her predicament pressing down on her. She was standing by the window, watching the last of the sun paint the snow-covered hills in shades of pink and gray, when a figure on horseback rode into town. It was Eli Boone. He did not stop at the saloon or the general store, but rode directly to her small house. He dismounted and approached, his steps sure-footed in the snow. Ada opened the door. He stood on her stoop, holding his hat in his hands. He looked tired. The lines around his eyes etched deeper than usual. "Miss Hart, I was out checking my fences along the North Range. The main bridge is gone." "I know," Ada said. "I just heard." Eli nodded, his gaze steady. "There is another way. An old Ute trail. It cuts across my land and comes out about a mile below the mission. It is rough, but it is passable. Once the ground firms up a bit, tomorrow, maybe the day after, when you are ready to go, I can guide you." He did not ask who she was taking or why she needed to go. He simply saw a problem and offered a solution. It was a gesture of such profound and simple decency that it almost brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Boone," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she could not name. "That is very kind." "My fence line took a beating in the storm," he said, as if to downplay his offer. "I will be riding it tomorrow anyway." He was about to turn and leave when he grimaced, flexing his right hand. Ada saw the dark line of blood welling up from a long, ragged tear across his palm. "What happened?" she asked. "New wire I was stringing. Fought back." He tried to wrap it in a handkerchief, but the movement was clumsy. "Let me see that," Ada said, her tone shifting from that of a grateful woman to a capable nurse. She drew him inside, into the front room, and made him sit. "You will get an infection if you do not clean it properly." She brought her medical box and gently took his hand. The cut was deep, snagged by a barb. Her touch was gentle but firm as she cleaned the wound with carbolic soap and water. Eli sat perfectly still, his eyes on her bent head. On the way, a stray piece of hair had escaped her bun. The room was quiet save for the hiss of the lantern and the soft sound of her movements. He was acutely aware of her closeness, the scent of soap and herbs that clung to her. She wrapped the wound with a clean linen bandage, her fingers deft and sure. As she tied the knot, her hand trembled, just for a second. It was not from nervousness, but from the raw cold of the day that still clung to them both. "There," she said, her voice a little breathless. "You must keep it clean." "I will," he said, his voice low. He looked down at his bandaged hand, then back at her. "Thank you." He stood, but did not leave immediately. "Vane is squeezing this town. Miss Hart, he is trying to squeeze me off my land by choking my water. That ditch, it is everything. Without it, my stock will not survive the summer. He is using the law to do it. But what he is doing is not right." Ada looked at him, and for the first time, She felt she was not entirely alone in her fight. His struggle and hers were different, yet they flowed from the same source, the unchecked power of one man. The fight for water and the fight for a child were becoming the same thing. After he left, a deep twilight settled over Silt Creek. A man in a heavy coat stood in the alley across from her shop, his face obscured by shadow, watching her window. Ada saw him and quickly drew the curtains. A few minutes later, she heard a faint scraping sound at the front door. When she looked, a folded piece of paper had been wedged into the space beneath it. Her hands shook as she picked it up. The writing was crude, scrawled in charcoal. "Bring the girl to the town hall. Sunday, noon." The note was a declaration of war. Ada read it twice, her blood running cold. Then she fed the scrap of paper to the flames in the hearth. Sunday. They had less than 2 days. Flight was no longer a choice. It was the only option. She explained the situation to Eli in the pre-dawn darkness of the next morning, the words brief and grim. He simply nodded, his face a mask of resolve in the lantern light. He had already saddled his own steady gelding and was leading a smaller, gentler mare for her and Rosie. The journey was a battle against a landscape that wanted them gone. The Ute Trail was a ghost of a path, a faint depression in the snow that only Eli's experienced eyes could follow. The wind had risen again, not with the blind fury of the blizzard, but with a sharp, cutting edge that felt personal, as if it were trying to slice through their layers of wool and resolve. The sky was the color of lead, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on the vast, white emptiness of the prairie. Rosie, bundled in so many layers she looked like a small, round bear, rode in front of Ada. The child was silent, her small hands clutching the saddle horn, her face buried in Ada's coat. For 2 hours they pushed onward. The only sounds the crunch of the horses' hooves in the snow and the relentless whistle of the wind. They reached the creek in the late morning. It was not the gentle stream of summer, but a swollen, angry torrent of half-frozen slush and jagged plates of ice. The water, churned up by the rapid melt, had not frozen solid but was a treacherous, shifting mosaic. Eli dismounted. He tested the edge with his boot, and a section of ice gave way with a sickening crack, revealing the dark, fast-moving water beneath. He shook his head. "We cannot ride them across. We will have to lead them and walk it." He took the reins of both horses. He looked at Ada, his eyes serious. "Stay directly behind me. Step where I step. If the ice cracks, spread your weight." The crossing was a nightmare. The wind tore at them, trying to unbalance them. The ice groaned and shifted under their feet like a living thing. Ada held the storm lantern, its small flame a fragile beacon against the gray day, while her other hand held tightly to Rosie's. Halfway across, a large sheet of ice tilted under Eli's weight. He stumbled, and the mare shied, her eyes wide with terror. A web of black cracks radiated out from where Ada stood. Eli did not hesitate. He turned, and in one smooth motion, he lifted Rosie into his arms. The child let out a small gasp but did not cry. "Go," he said to Ada, his voice tight. "Move quickly now." Ada scrambled forward, her boots slipping, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could feel the ice giving way beneath her feet. She reached the far bank and turned, holding the lantern high. Eli was right behind her, carrying Rosie as if she weighed nothing, his own steps now dangerously uncertain on the fragmenting ice. He lunged the last few feet, pushing Rosie toward Ada as he found purchase on the muddy bank. He had pulled them through. They were safe. The mission of Sister Alma was a small, sturdy stone building set in a hollow of the hills, sheltered from the worst of the wind. It felt like a different world from Silt Creek, a place of quiet contemplation and solid faith. Sister Alma herself was a woman whose placid face belied a will of iron. She listened to Ada's story without interruption, her hands folded in the sleeves of her black habit. She took Rosie to the kitchen for warm milk and bread, leaving Ada and Eli in her small, spare office. When she returned, her expression was grave. "You have done a good and brave thing," "Ada," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "but goodness is not a shield in the courts of men. Vane has papers, you say, a contract of labor. The court will see a runaway child who belongs to him, and a woman who is illegally harboring her. They will not see the truth unless you can show it to them in a way they cannot ignore." "But what can we do?" Ada asked, a note of desperation in her voice. "You need proof," Sister Alma said. "Proof of his unfitness, proof that he wants the child not for her labor, but for some other purpose. Men like Silas Vane are motivated by greed. Find the greed, and you will find his weakness." She would keep Rosie for now, she assured them, a sanctuary under the protection of the church, but it was only a temporary reprieve. Later, as Rosie napped in a small, clean cot, Ada sat by the window, watching the snow begin to fall again. The sight of the child, safe for the moment, unlocked the door to the cold back parlor of her own memory. Years ago, there had been another hope, a tiny life growing within her. A winter fever had swept through Silt Creek, and it had taken her strength, and with it, the baby. The loss had hollowed her out, leaving a space filled with a quiet, aching guilt. She had locked that part of herself away, convinced she was unfit, that she had failed in the most fundamental way. Rosie's whispered words, "I just want a mom," had not been a knife, but a key, turning the lock on that long-sealed room. It was not just Rosie she was fighting for. It was for the ghost of the child she had lost, and for the woman she had been afraid to become. A commotion at the mission's front gate broke her reverie. Deputy Crane was there, his horse pawing at the ground, a piece of paper in his hand. He demanded entry, claiming he had an order to inspect the premises for a missing child. Sister Alma met him at the door, a formidable, unmovable presence. "This is church property. Deputy," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "Your civil orders have no standing here without the bishop's seal. Show me your warrant." Crane puffed out his chest. Taken aback, "This is a writ of inspection from the town council." "A council of 3 merchants has no authority over the house of God," Sister Alma retorted. "Now, unless you have a properly executed warrant from a territorial judge, I suggest you leave these grounds." Crane was flustered. His bluff called, Eli, who had been standing quietly in the shadows of the porch, stepped forward. "Deputy," he said, his tone reasonable. "Perhaps if you just signed your name to that writ and added the date, Sister Alma could send it along to the bishop for his consideration. It would show you followed procedure." It was a clever trap, playing to Crane's vanity and his desire to appear official. The deputy, eager to salvage some dignity, took the pencil Eli offered and proudly scrawled his signature across the bottom of the useless document. Eli took the paper back, folded it neatly, and slipped it into his coat pocket. A small, seemingly insignificant victory, but a piece of evidence nonetheless. Crane, defeated, mounted his horse and rode away, shouting threats over his shoulder. The journey back was treacherous. The new snow was coming down fast, and darkness was falling. Eli's ranch was closer than town. "It is not safe to go on," he said. "You can take shelter in my barn for the night." The barn was a refuge, smelling of hay and horses and honest work. It was warmer than the open air, and dry. Eli lit a lantern and made a space for Ada in a clean stall, piling hay for a comfortable bed. As he turned, the lantern light caught a fresh tear in his coat, and a long, bloody scrape on his shoulder beneath it. It must have happened when he scrambled up the creek bank. "Sit down," Ada said, her voice leaving no room for argument. She took out the small medical kit she always carried. He hesitated, then did as she said, sitting on a hay bale and shrugging out of his coat. He kept his back partially to her as she worked, a gesture of respect and propriety that spoke volumes. The air in the barn was thick with a silent understanding. This was not a man and a woman in a compromising situation. This was one person, worn down by the world, tending to the wounds of another. Ada cleaned the scrape, her touch as light as a feather. He did not flinch, but she felt the tension in his shoulders. They were two solitary people, brought together by a storm and a child and a shared sense of what was right. The warmth of the lantern cast their shadows long and dancing on the wooden walls. The intimacy of the moment was not in the touch, but in the shared silence, in the quiet trust that had grown between them. He thanked her when she was done, his voice rough with an emotion he did not name. She simply nodded. They ate a spare meal of hard biscuits and jerky from his saddlebags and spoke of practical things: the weather, the price of cattle, the depth of the snow. But beneath the simple words, a deeper conversation was taking place, a recognition of a shared strength, a shared burden. Ada slept surprisingly well, burrowed into the hay, the sound of the horses breathing nearby a comforting rhythm. She was woken just before dawn, not by the light, but by a sound that did not belong: a frantic whinnying, and a strange, hungry crackling, and then the smell of smoke. Eli was already outside when she scrambled from the barn. Against the dark, pre-dawn sky, a terrible orange light clawed at the heavens. His hay barn, the store of his entire winter's feed for his cattle, was engulfed in flames. The fire was a roaring monster, consuming the dry timbers and the tightly packed hay with an insatiable appetite. There was nothing to be done but watch it burn. As the cruel light of the fire painted their faces, Eli walked a slow circle around the perimeter of the blaze. In the soft, fresh snow, illuminated by the fire's glow, were a set of boot prints. They were deep and distinct. One of the heels had a unique V-shaped notch in it. Eli had seen that boot print before, just yesterday, in the snow outside the mission gate. They belonged to Deputy Crane. The message was as clear as the flames against the sky. If Vane could not take Eli's water by law, he would take his livelihood by fire. Sunday arrived cold and gray. The sky a lid of iron pressed down upon the snow. The fire at Eli's ranch was the talk of the town, a grim murmur that followed Ada and Eli as they walked toward the church. They had spent the day after the fire salvaging what they could, which was next to nothing. Eli's face was smudged with soot and etched with a hard, weary resolve. He had lost his winter feed, but he had not lost his nerve. Sister Alma had arrived in Silt Creek that morning, bringing Rosie with her, her presence a silent statement of support that did not go unnoticed. The church was not a place of worship that day, but a courtroom of public opinion. It was crowded, the pews filled with the faces of Silt Creek, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, fear, and judgment. They were ranchers and merchants, wives and blacksmiths, and they were the jury. Mayor Thompson, a man whose spine was made more of jelly than of steel, sat at a makeshift table at the front, looking deeply uncomfortable. Silas Vane stood beside him, radiating an aura of confident ownership, as if the church and everyone in it belonged to him. Deputy Crane stood by the door, his hand resting on his pistol, his friendly smile looking more like a predator's grin. Ada sat in the front pew with Rosie tucked beside her, Sister Alma on the other side. Eli stood against the back wall, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed and unreadable. The air was thick with tension and the smell of damp wool. The mayor cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. "We are gathered here," he began, his voice wavering, "to address a serious matter, a matter of a missing child and of irregular guardianship. Mr. Vane has brought a complaint." Silas Vane stepped forward, holding up a piece of paper with a flourish. "This is not a complaint, Mayor. It is a simple matter of law and property. This child, Rosie Pike, is an indentured laborer under my protection. I have a legally binding contract, signed by her previous guardian, giving me responsibility for her welfare and her work. She is fed, she is housed, she is cared for. In return, she performs simple chores suited to her age." He paused, letting his words sink in. "A few weeks ago, she ran off, a childish whim. No doubt, she was found by Miss Hart, who, with the best of intentions, I am sure has kept the child in her home, depriving her of her lawful and safe environment. All I ask is for the return of my property and for this unfortunate incident to be concluded." He made it sound so reasonable, so utterly final. He was the benevolent guardian, Ada the misguided meddler. He handed the paper to the mayor, who studied it as if he had never seen such a document before. Ada felt Rosie tremble beside her. She placed a calming hand on the girl's shoulder and stood up. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried a quiet authority that made every head turn. "Mr. Vane," she began, addressing him directly, "you speak of care and welfare. Let me tell you what I saw the night I found Rosie. I did not find a well-cared-for child. I found a girl hiding under a bench, shivering so hard her teeth chattered. Her coat was in rags, her knees were scraped raw, and the cuts were filled with dirt. She was hungry. Mayor, so hungry she could barely swallow the cocoa I gave her. Her hands were covered in rough calluses, not from simple chores, but from hard, punishing labor. These are not the signs of a safe environment. They are the signs of neglect." She spoke as a nurse, her words precise and factual, painting a picture that was stark and undeniable. A murmur went through the crowd. These were details they could understand, the practical evidence of hardship. Vane laughed. A short, dismissive sound. "The girl is a runaway. Of course she was disheveled. Miss Hart is an emotional woman, seeing what she wants to see. The law is what matters here, not a few scrapes and a healthy appetite. The contract is legal. It is a contract for labor, Mr. Boone, not for mistreatment," a clear voice said from the back. Eli had pushed himself off the wall, and the law requires that even legal matters be conducted by lawful men. "What is that supposed to mean?" Crane snapped, his hand tightening on his gun. Eli walked forward, pulling a folded paper from his coat pocket. "It means that on Friday evening, Deputy Crane here came to Sister Alma's mission. He carried a document he called a writ of inspection from the town council, and he used it to threaten a woman of the cloth on church grounds. He acted outside his authority, and he tried to intimidate his way into a place where he had no legal right to be." He unfolded the paper. "Sister Alma was kind enough to point out his error, and I was kind enough to provide him with a pencil so he could properly sign his illegitimate document." He held it up for the mayor to see. Crane's arrogant signature was scrawled across the bottom. Sister Alma then stood, her presence commanding a deep respect. "What Mr. Boone says is true. The deputy came with threats, not with the law. He had no warrant. He was there to serve Mr. Vane's interests, not the interests of this community." The mayor looked from the paper to Crane's reddening face. The foundation of Vane's legal authority was beginning to crumble. The crowd was shifting, the whispers growing louder, more uncertain. "This is a distraction," Vane boomed, trying to regain control, a desperate attempt to change the subject. "The fact remains, the child belongs with me, Miss Hart. A single woman with no family is hardly a suitable guardian. What does she know of raising a child?" The words were meant to sting, to remind the town of the old whispers, of Ada's solitary, walled-off life, and they did. Ada felt the old shame rise in her throat, hot and bitter. But then she looked at Rosie, at her small, frightened face, and a different feeling rose to meet it. Not shame, but a fierce, protective clarity. She turned, not to Vane or the mayor, but to the people in the pews. She looked at Lillian Mayhew, at the blacksmith, at the women she had shared coffee with, and the men whose wounds she had stitched. Her voice, when she spoke again, was different. The clinical precision was gone, replaced by a profound, aching sincerity that silenced the entire room. "Mr. Vane asks what I know of raising a child, and the town has always wondered why I keep to myself. I will tell you, years ago, I was going to have a baby, but there was a fever that winter, and I lost the child before he was ever born." The confession hung in the cold air, a truth so private and so painful that no one dared to breathe. She did not weep or raise her voice. She simply stated the fact, the hard, central stone of her solitude. I locked that part of my life away," she continued, her voice trembling just once. "I thought that door was closed forever." And then, a little girl, cold and afraid, huddled under a bench in a blizzard. "I do not want the law to decide this. I do not want contracts to decide it. I just know that I do not want another child to be left alone in the cold." The silence that followed was absolute. In that moment, she was not just the seamstress, not just the strange, solitary woman. She was a mother who had lost a child, and her grief gave her a moral authority that Vane's money and legal papers could not touch. The mayor, for all his weakness, was not a monster. He looked at Ada's face, then at Vane's angry, contorted features, and he faltered. This is more complicated than a simple contract," he stammered. "There are accusations, serious ones. I cannot make a ruling today. I will need time to investigate these claims. 3 days. We will meet back here in 3 days, and I will make my decision then. In the meantime, the child will remain with Sister Alma at the mission." It was a small victory, a temporary stay of execution. Vane's face was a thundercloud. He strode over to where Ada and Eli stood. He leaned in close, his voice a low, venomous hiss meant only for them. 3 days, he sneered. "A lot can happen in 3 days. 3 days is more than enough time for weak people to pack up and leave this town for good." He turned and stormed out of the church, Crane scurrying behind him like a kicked dog. The threat was unmistakable. It was not over. It had just begun. That evening, Ada and Eli sat in her small kitchen, the lantern casting a warm, golden light. The fear was still there, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach. But something else was there too, a sense of rightness, of having finally opened the door to that back room and let the light in. They could run. They could take Rosie and disappear into the territory. It would be the sensible thing to do. Eli looked at her across the small table, his eyes meeting hers. He had lost his hay, the lifeblood of his ranch. He had every reason to cut his losses and go. "He will not stop," Ada said quietly. "No," Eli agreed. "He will not." She took a deep breath. "Then we cannot stop either. Running is not enough. We have to find proof. Proof of what he is doing to those children at the camp. Proof of what he is doing with the water." Eli nodded slowly. He reached across the table and touched her hand, his fingers rough and calloused against hers. It was not a gesture of romance, but of solidarity. A promise. "We will find it," he said. The 3-day reprieve was not a grace period. It was a deadline. There was no time for deliberation. Action was the only currency they had left, before the sun had fully risen on Monday morning. Eli led Ada out of Silk Creek, not toward the mission, but upstream, following the winding path of the frozen creek. He moved with a hunter's quiet intensity, his eyes reading the landscape for signs that were invisible to her. He led her away from the main trail, into a thicket of willows that rattled their bare, brittle branches in the wind. The snow here was less disturbed. Pushing through the last of the brush, they emerged into a small, hidden clearing. And there it was. Ada drew in a sharp breath. It was a dam, but a crude and ugly one. A temporary chokehold on the creek. It was a messy barricade of felled logs, packed earth and rocks, designed to raise the water level just enough to divert a significant portion of the flow into a freshly dug ditch. This new ditch snaked away from the main creek, heading directly east toward the vast, thirsty lands of Silas Vane. It was a thief's work, done in secret. This was the proof of his intent, the physical manifestation of the greed Sister Alma had spoken of. He was not just trying to control the water, he was actively stealing it. Tucked back in the trees, almost invisible from the creek, was a small, ramshackle shed. It was little more than a lean-to, a place to store tools and supplies for the dam's construction. The door was not locked. Inside, it smelled of pine resin, damp earth, and rust. Coils of rope sat in one corner. a barrel of iron nails in another, alongside bags of salt for softening the frozen ground. In the dusty light filtering through the cracks in the walls, Ada saw a small, leather-bound ledger lying on an overturned crate. She picked it up, blowing a film of dust from the cover. Her fingers, accustomed to the fine detail of needlework, carefully turned the stiff pages. It was a simple record of supplies, with dates and quantities scrawled in a rough hand. She scanned the entries, her eyes moving quickly down the columns. Then she stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. "Eli, what day was it that your barn—" She could not bring herself to say the word. He looked over her shoulder, his face grim. "Thursday night." There on the page, under the heading for Thursday, was a clear entry: 3 coils of rope, 2 bags of nails, 1 large sack of salt, the very supplies a man would need to bar a door from the outside and ensure a fire caught quickly and burned hot. The transaction was a ghost, a silent witness to the crime. It was not enough for a court of law, perhaps, but for them, it was a confession written in ink. As they were about to leave, a rustling sound from a pile of old grain sacks in the corner made them both freeze. Eli moved silently, his hand resting on the handle of the hunting knife at his belt. He kicked the top sack aside. Huddled beneath were 2 boys, no older than 10, their faces pale with terror and smudged with dirt. They were thin as rails, dressed in rags that offered little protection from the cold. They recoiled, shielding their faces as if expecting a blow. Ada knelt, her movement slow and gentle. "It is all right," she said, her voice soft. "We are not going to hurt you." They stared at her, their eyes wide and untrusting. "You are from Mr. Vane's camp, are you not?" Ada asked gently. The older boy gave a jerky nod, his eyes darting toward the door, looking for an escape. "Rosie told us about it," Ada continued. "She is safe now." The mention of the name seemed to break through their fear. "You know Rosie," the younger one whispered, his voice hoarse. "Is she all right?" "She is very well," Ada said with a reassuring smile. "And we want to help you too." The story came out in a torrent of whispered, fearful words. They had run away the night before, after the foreman had worked them until one of them collapsed from exhaustion. They spoke of the cold and the hunger, and of the deputy, Crane, who would visit the camp and watch, doing nothing to stop the foreman's rough handling of the children. They had followed the new ditch, thinking it might lead them to the main town. Ada and Eli exchanged a look. They had found more than they had bargained for, not just proof of water theft and arson, but living witnesses to the cruelty of Vane's operation. They had to get the boys to the mission. Eli knew a shortcut, a series of low ridges that would be faster than following the winding creek. He led the way, with Ada and the 2 boys following close behind. The sun was higher now, and the prairie, which had seemed so beautiful in the morning light, now felt vast and exposed. The dry, yellow grass of the previous summer poked up through the snow in stiff, brittle clumps, as flammable as tinder. They were halfway across a wide, open basin when Eli suddenly stopped, holding up a hand. On a distant ridge to the south, a group of riders had appeared, silhouetted against the bright sky. Even at this distance, there was no mistaking the figure in the lead. It was Deputy Crane, and he had seen them. There was a shout, faint on the wind, and the riders spurred their horses, charging down the slope. "Run," Eli said, his voice low and urgent. He vaulted into his saddle and pulled the older boy up behind him. Ada scrambled onto her mare, her heart pounding, and helped the younger boy up in front of her. They dug their heels into their horses' flanks and raced across the frozen prairie. The chase was a desperate, thundering flight. The dry grass crunched under the horses' hooves. The wind tore at their faces, cold and sharp. Ada could hear the shouts of their pursuers getting closer. One of Crane's men, a brutish man with a cruel face, drew alongside them. He reached for her reins, his lips peeled back in a sneer. He was smoking a cigarette, and as he lunged, he took a final puff and carelessly flicked the butt away. It landed in a thick patch of dry grass. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a tiny orange spark glowed, hesitated, and with a sudden whoosh, erupted into a flower of flame. The wind, which had been their enemy all morning, now shifted, turning on their pursuers. The small flame, fanned by the sudden gust, became a wall of fire, racing across the prairie with terrifying speed. The dry grass exploded in its path. Crane and his men, caught by surprise, were forced to wheel their horses around, trying to outrun the monster they had unleashed. But the fire was a wild thing, and it was now a danger to them all. It was spreading north, a rolling wave of orange and black smoke, directly toward the town of Silt Creek. Ada and Eli raced on, the roar of the fire behind them. They reached a deep, narrow ravine, spanned by an old, decaying bridge made of railroad ties. It was their only way across. They clattered over the bridge, the old wood groaning under the horses' weight. On the other side, Eli pulled his horse to a halt. They were trapped. The ravine was too deep to cross anywhere else, and the fire was closing in, cutting off their retreat. From the hills to the west, a lone rider was approaching. It was Sister Alma, on her way back to the mission. Rosie was riding behind her. The child saw the plume of black smoke, the orange glow against the sky. Ada saw her point, saw the nun turn, and then, to her astonishment, she saw Rosie slide off the horse, grab the reins of the nun's sturdy mount, and turn it back toward town, kicking its flanks and shouting for help. Eli was staring at the landscape, his eyes narrowed, his mind working with a desperate speed. He looked at the approaching fire, then at the ravine, and then his gaze followed the line of the secret ditch Vane had built. It ran less than 100 yards from the bridge. He looked at Ada, his face set with a terrible, brilliant idea. "The dam," he said, his voice tight. "If we can break the dam, the water will follow this gully. It will create a fire break. It might save the town." The idea was audacious, a piece of battlefield improvisation, but Ada saw the flaw, the moral trap. "But that is Vane's property," she said, her voice filled with doubt. "We cannot just destroy it. Do we have the right to take his water?" Eli turned to her, his eyes blazing with a fierce certainty. "This is not his water, Ada," he said, his voice cutting through the roar of the fire. "He stole it. He stole it from the creek, from my land, from the whole valley. This is our shared water that he took first. We are not taking it. We are setting it free." He spurred his horse toward the dam, Ada right behind him. The structure was crude, its key component a heavy wooden lever that controlled a sluice gate. It would take both of them. They jumped from their horses and put their shoulders to the heavy timber. It resisted, groaning under the strain. "Push!" Eli yelled over the fire. With a final desperate heave, they threw their combined weight against it. There was a sharp crack of splintering wood, and the lever gave way. The sluice gate tore open, and with a deep, guttural roar, the pent-up water of the Silt Creek surged through the opening. It poured into the dry gully, a churning, muddy torrent, carrying ice and debris with it. It hit the fire line with a great hiss of steam, turning the dry earth to black mud. The fire was stopped, its path to the town blocked by a newly born river. The flood of water surged down the ravine. Deputy Crane, who had been trying to find a way across, was caught in the torrent. The water knocked him off his feet, sending him tumbling. His pistol was torn from his grasp and disappeared into the muddy water. He struggled to his feet, soaked and sputtering, disarmed and defeated. And on the far ridge, beyond the smoke and the steam, a new group of riders appeared. Silas Vane sat on his horse, flanked by 2 armed men, his face a mask of pure fury. The final battle was not avoided. It had just been given a new and terrible stage. The world had shrunk to a narrow stage of mud and steam, poised between a dying fire and an angry sky. Silas Vane, his face a mask of black fury, urged his horse down the ridge, his 2 hired men flanking him. They were not lawmen. They were enforcers, their faces hard and empty. their hands resting on the butts of their holstered pistols. They stopped on the far side of the new, churning channel of water, the ground already soft and treacherous. "You have destroyed my property," Vane's voice boomed across the water, a sound like tearing metal. "You have stolen my water. You will pay for this." He drew his pistol, not with the haste of a man in a duel, but with the slow, deliberate motion of a man who owned the world and was tired of its insolence. "I am going to put a bullet in that man's leg, and then I am going to take back what is mine." He began to raise the gun. At that moment, a small figure scrambled over the rise behind Ada. It was Rosie. Her face was streaked with soot, her eyes wide with terror. But she did not hesitate. She ran and planted herself directly in front of Ada, a tiny, defiant shield. She was trembling from head to toe, but she did not move back. Vane laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Get out of the way, you stupid girl." Eli did not shout. He did not draw a weapon. He moved with a quiet, deadly efficiency. His eyes had already traced the path of a thick rope left over from the dam's construction. A rope that snaked from a stout pine tree to a heavy log that had served as part of the temporary barricade near the edge of the bank where Vane's horse now stood. In 3 quick strides, Eli was at the pine tree. With a single, powerful tug on the rope, he yanked the log free from the mud. It rolled a few feet, just enough to strike the hind legs of Vane's horse. The animal, already spooked by the fire and the water, screamed and reared. Vane, caught completely by surprise, was thrown from the saddle. He landed with a heavy, wet thud in the thick, black mud of the new riverbank, his expensive coat and his dignity swallowed by the earth. His 2 men, momentarily stunned, started to draw their weapons, but it was too late. Over the ridge, a crowd was appearing. First a few riders, then men on foot, then women and children, their faces a mixture of fear and awe at the sight of the tamed fire and the diverted creek. Rosie's ride had not been in vain. Silt Creek had come. Deputy Crane, soaked and shivering, saw his chance to salvage his own skin. He pointed a shaking finger at Eli. "He did it. It was all him. I was just following orders." Ada turned to face him, her eyes clear and cold. Orders have to have a conscience. "Deputy," she said, her voice cutting through his panicked whining. "You chose to follow a man. You should have chosen to follow what was right." The crowd drew closer, their initial confusion hardening into a collective understanding as they saw the 2 frightened boys huddled behind Ada, and the mud-caked, furious figure of Silas Vane struggling to his feet. At the front of the crowd were Sister Alma and the town's physician, Dr. Merritt, and in the doctor's hand, he held a leather-bound ledger. Mayor Thompson pushed his way through, his face pale and beaded with sweat. "What in God's name is going on here?" Sister Alma stepped forward, her presence a beacon of unwavering calm. "What is going on? Mayor, is justice. Mr. Vane claims to be the lawful guardian of these children, but Dr. Merritt's medical records tell a different story." The doctor opened his book. His voice was dry and academic, but the words he read were a damning indictment. "I have treated 3 other children from Mr. Vane's work camp in the past year," he announced, his voice carrying in the sudden hush. "For malnutrition, for infected cuts, for bruises consistent with rough handling. These boys are not cared for. They are used." Furthermore, Sister Alma continued, holding up the contract Vane had brandished in the church, "We had the seal on this document examined by the telegraph operator, who has experience with official papers. It is a forgery. It is not a legal instrument. It is a lie." The townspeople murmured, the sound a low, angry growl. They looked from the doctor's book to the terrified boys, from the forged paper to the man now covered in mud, and the pieces of the story clicked into place. They had been afraid of the drought, and Vane had offered them water, but now they saw the price: the stolen creek, the burned barn, the abused children. Their fear of Vane was finally being eclipsed by their shame. Mayor Thompson looked at the faces of his town, and for the first time, he saw not a mob to be managed, but a community demanding justice. A flicker of long dormant courage sparked within him. "Silas Vane," he declared, his voice shaking but resolute. "By the authority of this township and the laws of Wyoming Territory, I am placing you and Deputy Crane under arrest. For fraud, for assault, and for false impersonation of a legal guardian." Vane stared, his face contorted with disbelief and rage. "You cannot be serious," he spat, wiping mud from his cheek. "I own this town." He fumbled inside his ruined coat and pulled out a second, smaller pistol. The crowd gasped and fell back. He raised the gun, his eyes wild, but Eli was already moving. He lunged, not at Vane, but at his arm, grabbing his wrist and forcing it upward. The two men struggled, their boots slipping in the mud. The gun went off with a deafening crack, the bullet firing harmlessly into the gray sky. Vane cried out and staggered back, clutching his head, his face a mask of agony. Eli had not struck him, but the percussive blast of the pistol, so close to his ear, had done its own damage. He stared blankly, a look of profound confusion on his face. He could see their mouths moving, but he could hear nothing but a high, piercing ring, as if the gunshot had been a signal. The heavy gray sky finally broke. A soft, steady rain began to fall. It hissed on the dying embers of the fire, turning the last of the smoke to clean steam. It pattered on the dusty coats of the townspeople and washed the soot from Ada's face. It was a gentle rain, a rain of cleansing and release. Ada knelt and pulled Rosie into her arms, burying her face in the child's tangled hair. She held her tight, a silent promise of safety, of home. Eli came and stood behind them. He did not speak. He did not intrude on their moment. He simply placed his hand on Ada's shoulder. It was a light touch, but it was as solid and as steady as the earth beneath them. It was enough. The falling action was swift and quiet, like the rain itself. Vane and Crane were taken into custody, their power broken, their reign of fear ended. The town council, under the steady gaze of Sister Alma and the doctor, voted to place the other children from the work camp into the care of local families who volunteered on the spot. The secret dam was dismantled, and the stolen water was returned to its rightful course, the main channel now to be managed by a community trust, ensuring it was shared fairly by all. A few days later, a new sign appeared outside Ada Hart's small house. It hung beside the old one that read, "Seamstress and Mending." The new sign was painted in a clear, clean script. It did not offer a service or a trade. It was an invitation. It read, "Whoever comes, please knock. This house always has a warm seat." The seasons turned, melting the memory of the hard winter into the green promise of a Wyoming spring. The creek, now flowing in its rightful channel, was a ribbon of silver life through the valley. Silt Creek was quieter now, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was not the silence of fear, but the calm of a town that had found its footing. The door to Ada's back parlor now stood open most days. The cold, still air had been replaced by the scent of baking bread and the sound of Rosie's quiet humming as she practiced her letters at the small table. One afternoon, Ada went to the small wooden chest in the corner. She lifted the lid and took out the bundle of old letters, their papers softened with age. For a long moment, she simply held them, feeling the weight of the life they represented. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she untied the faded ribbon. She did not read the letters. She did not need to. She stacked them neatly, the sharp edges of her past smoothed into a simple pile. From her sewing box, she took a new length of ribbon, a bright, cheerful blue, and tied it around the bundle. She placed the letters back in the chest, not as ghosts to be locked away, but as a closed chapter in a longer book. She was closing the chest when Rosie came in, holding a piece of carefully lettered cardboard. On it, in a child's earnest scrawl, were the words, "Rosie's room." "Mom?" she asked, her voice shy but proud. "Can I hang this on the door?" Ada looked from the chest to the sign, and then to the child's hopeful face. A slow, genuine smile spread across her own. "Yes, Rosie," she said, "I think that is a wonderful idea." Outside, a new sound had joined the whisper of the wind in the pines. It was the gentle, rhythmic creak of a small windmill. Eli had spent a week assembling it. A strange and beautiful structure of wood and metal blades that now stood beside the small patch of earth behind Ada's house. He had dug a shallow well, and the windmill, catching the endless Wyoming breeze, now pumped a steady, gentle stream of water into a small ditch that fed the rows of wildflowers Ada had planted. He had said with a quiet smile, just making sure the water went where it was needed most. Life settled into a new rhythm, marked by small, shared moments. One warm afternoon, they worked together in the garden, building a lattice for the squash vines to climb. As Ada was tying a vine with a piece of twine, a sharp edge of the wood scraped her hand, drawing a thin line of blood. Eli saw it immediately. He stopped his work and took her hand gently in his touch infinitely careful. He led her to the water pump and washed the small wound, his rough fingers surprisingly gentle. He dried it on a clean piece of cloth, and then, from a small tin he carried for just such occasions, he applied a salve and a neat linen bandage. It was the same care she had shown him, a quiet, reciprocal act of tending that was more intimate than any embrace. That evening, they sat together on the back porch as the sun went down, casting long, peaceful shadows across the prairie. They shared a piece of warm cornbread, passing it back and forth in comfortable silence. The air grew cooler, and a comfortable quiet settled between them. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he draped an arm around her, the gesture as natural and as necessary as breathing. The day's work was done. The world was quiet. He turned his head, and she lifted hers. Their first kiss was not a thing of fire and passion, but of deep, quiet certainty. It was short and slow, a promise made without words in the fading light. A month later, the entire town of Silt Creek gathered for a potluck supper to celebrate the coming of summer. Lanterns were strung between the livery and the general store, casting a warm, festive glow on the faces of the community. The sound of a badly tuned fiddle mixed with laughter and conversation. It was a town remade, not by grand speeches, but by small acts of courage that had rippled outward. Ada stood talking with Sister Alma, a cup of lemonade in her hand, a feeling of peace settling over her that she had not thought possible. She watched Rosie playing a game of tag with the other children, her laughter a bright, clear sound in the evening air. Then she saw Rosie stop her game. The child's face took on an expression of profound seriousness. She walked over to where Eli was talking with the blacksmith, took his large, calloused hand in her small one, and began to pull him purposefully through the crowd. She led him directly to Ada. Rosie looked from Ada's face to Eli's, her brow furrowed in concentration, as if she were trying to solve the most difficult problem in the world. I just wanted a mom, she said, her voice a little breathless but clear and determined. But I guess a mom needs someone who can fix the roof, too. The entire town seemed to hold its breath. Eli looked down at the child, a slow, warm smile spreading across his face. Then he looked at Ada, and his expression was open, vulnerable, and full of a love that needed no more hiding. "Ada," he said, his voice low and steady, meant only for her, but heard by all. "If you need a husband who knows when to be silent and when to speak up, who knows how to pump water for a flower garden, and for a heart, then I am asking to stand right here." Tears welled in Ada's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or of loss. They were tears of a joy so profound it filled all the empty spaces inside her. She did not need words. She simply nodded. A single, decisive movement that was an answer to everything. A cheer went up from the townspeople, but it was not a boisterous, rowdy sound. It was a warm, heartfelt applause, the sound of a family celebrating one of its own. Summer settled deep and warm over the Wyoming prairie. On a bright, clear afternoon, 3 figures on horseback could be seen moving across a vast field of waving grass. Eli and Ada rode side by side, their hands occasionally brushing. Just ahead of them, Rosie rode the gentle mare, her back straight and proud. The wind, coming down from the high country, was warm and smelled of sweet grass and sunshine. In the distance, the steeple of the mission caught the sun, a point of steady light, and below it, unseen but known, the waters of Silt Creek shimmered as they flowed, clean and true, toward the horizon. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. Please comment with where you are listening from in the world so we can all connect, and be sure to subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.